I'm Graham Sheldon. She began life simply known as Hull 534. She went on to become one of the most famous vessels in maritime lore. With a long history that spans wars, tragedies, and triumphs, she is globally recognized and is certainly worthy of her royal name. This is the Queen Mary. In response to an increase in ship construction from Germany, both major British shipbuilders, White Star Line and Cunard, began building their own competing ocean liners. Cunard labeled the vessel Hull 534 as work began.
Work started in 1930 at the John Brown shipyard in Clydebank, Scotland. But due to the Great Depression, work stopped about a year later.
The ship's future was in doubt until the British government stepped in with a proposition.
The British government offered Cunard a loan to finish building both of the ships if they would agree to merge with their rival shipping company, and that was the White Star Line. The White Star Line is the company that had owned the Titanic. Because of the Depression, it put everybody out of work. So the only way the British government felt that they could finish building the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth was to have the two largest companies combine into one. They took them up on that offer. It became the Cunard White Star Line.
The newly formed Cunard White Star Line proceeded with construction, and the vessel began to take shape.
She was launched in September of 1934, and the hull of the ship was slid into the river. Cunard Line originally wanted to name this ship the Queen Victoria, after Queen Victoria. And so the president of Cunard went to the king and said, "We want to name the ship after England's most beloved queen." And King George looked at him and said, "Oh, my wife will be so happy to hear that," his wife being Queen Mary. So the story goes that they couldn't change their mind at that point, and she became known as the Queen Mary.
And the Queen Mary was born. But her original mission wasn't to become one of the world's most famous passenger liners.
Since Cunard began, they were in the business of hauling mail, and they thought, as long as we've got a cross with mail, we may as well throw up a few staterooms and take some passengers with. It was totally an afterthought. It became the very chic way to travel to Europe.
The new Queen Mary was so impressive in size that the British public quickly made the vessel its premier ocean liner.
Back then, each country, they took great pride in their flagship. Every country had a ship that they touted.
The Queen Mary was always intended to have a design that would appeal to citizens of Britain, and nowhere is the same more evident than in the interior passages of the ship.
They wanted her to reflect a very English country kind of manner type feeling. This is why they used so much wood. There are 56 different types of wood veneer used in the interior decoration of the ship, harvested from all over the British Empire. The Queen Mary, many people don't realize that she's one of the largest collections of original Art Deco artwork and architecture anywhere in the world. The chief designer of this ship was Sir John Brown. The interiors, the work was farmed out to a lot of artists and artisans. There were over 30 artists and artisans that were commissioned by the British government to create the artwork and the Art Deco architecture in the ship.
After the interior furnishings were complete and the final touches were placed on the vessel, the Queen Mary began her first journey.
She set sail on her maiden voyage May 27th, 1936. The arrival on her maiden voyage on June 2nd of 1936 into New York Harbor, she was flower-bombed with white carnations, and police and fire vessels came out to meet her. I mean, it was a huge arrival.
The Queen Mary so impressed the public, partially because of the scale of the mammoth vessel.
Queen Mary is 1,019 and a half feet long, 118 feet wide, 185 feet high. She contained 12 decks. She weighs 81,237 gross tons. She's approximately twice the size of the Titanic. The Titanic could fit almost 2 times inside the Queen Mary. She usually carried 2,000 passengers and 1,200 crew members per crossing.
When the Queen Mary, Royalty on the Seas, returns, we'll discover her wartime role during the dangerous Atlantic crossings. Welcome back. Throughout the 1930s, the fame of the Queen Mary continued to grow as she carried many of society's elite across the Atlantic in the height of style. But the mission of Cunard White Star's most prized ocean liner was about to change as the world moved closer to war.
On September 3rd of 1939, World War II began in Europe. The Queen Mary was at sea. She was 2 days away from making her 143rd Atlantic crossing. Over the next 8 years, the course of this ship was changed totally.
During World War II, the Queen Mary was converted for use as a troop transport. Her distinctive paint scheme was covered over with gray paint, earning her the nickname the Gray Ghost. The ship was entirely stripped of all luxury and converted to her new wartime role.
Everything that could be removed was removed. Furniture, artwork, fragile fittings, 200 cases of silverware, china, crystal, all housed in warehouses along the Hudson for the duration of the war, replaced with wooden bunks, hammocks. Any public room was converted. The squash court on Sports Deck was outfitted to sleep 96, the gymnasium 88.
With her conversion to war complete, the Queen Mary was tasked with carrying large amounts of soldiers to Europe. Her tremendous size meant that entire divisions could be transported aboard.
In July of 1943, she carried 16,683 soldiers. That still stands as the largest number of human beings ever transported on one vessel. And I think the most difficult thing about it was, of the 16,000, half of them were seasick for the entire voyage.
With so many men aboard, the Navy did what they could to provide the Queen Mary with adequate protection.
She was escorted by 4 or 5 destroyers for about 150 miles outside of New York. Probably the same way coming back. Navy patrol planes or blimps would follow her for as long as their fuel held out. They would then signal good luck and turn around and head back for shore. It was at that time that the Queen Mary was left alone to cross the Atlantic until she was met by her British escorts off the coast of Ireland. Nobody could keep up with her because she was so fast.
Her speed was her greatest defense, and that made the vessel difficult to track by enemy ships. As division after division arrived to fight in Europe, the Axis powers grew more desperate to destroy the ship.
Adolf Hitler, as well as the Emperor of Japan, put up a $250,000 bounty, plus the Iron Cross with oak leaves, to any submarine captain who would sink the Queen Mary just to get her out of the way. She was on a zigzag pattern. She was on a different course every 8 minutes. She was going in a different direction every 8 minutes. And they never knew what course they would be steering until after they left port.
However, the dangers of World War II would not escape the Queen Mary entirely. As she plotted her complicated course across the Atlantic, tragedy struck.
In October of 1942, the Queen Mary was approaching the coast of Ireland about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and one of her escort cruisers, the HMS Curacao, was approaching starboard side forward end. They were not aware of the exact zigzag patterning that the Queen Mary was steering, and they attempted to cut in front of the Queen Mary just as the Queen Mary was turning into the direction of the Curacao. And the force of the Queen Mary sliced that smaller vessel into 2 pieces, killing 338 of the 439-member crew.
After the collision, the Queen Mary was unable to pick up the survivors.
She was under orders never to stop for any reason whatsoever. So the 101 survivors of the Curacao were rescued by other escort vessels who had been in the vicinity at that time.
Despite the tragedy of the Curacao, the contribution of the vessel during World War II was not lost on at least one famous Allied leader.
Sir Winston Churchill said that we were able to win World War II in the amount of time that we did because of the performance of this ship.
That extraordinary statement helped further propel the Queen Mary into the history books. With the war at an end, the ship was the Grey Ghost no longer, and she was completely overhauled to return to her luxury ocean liner days.
They took the opportunity to make some changes at that time. The chestnut oak paneling in Main Hall was covered over with the two-tone leather panels that you see today in there. The first-class ballroom was removed and turned into a cinema at that time.
With a shiny new coat of paint, the Queen Mary was ready to regain her command of the transatlantic transport business. Coming up, we'll go beneath the decks to discover what life was like aboard the world's most famous passenger liner.
Imagine a world without any limitations. A world in which our wildest questions could be answered. A world where machines are not just your dumb assistant, but have outsmarted us.
AIs will be able to emulate all the features of human intelligence.
What would the world be like when machines no longer need humans to improve themselves?
We just can't see these.
Welcome back to our look at the Queen Mary. In her day, the vessel was equipped with the highest level of technology available.
She was the first ship to be able to stay in contact with both sides of the Atlantic through the entire trip. She was the first ship to have a telephone system between all first-class staterooms and first-class suites. She was the first ship to have the most elevators. She had 21 elevators aboard. She was the first in a lot of ways. She generally traveled anywhere from 25 to 29 knots, which is roughly 30 to 32 miles per hour. She was the fastest liner in the world until 1952.
The Blue Ribbon was awarded to the passenger liner with the highest average speed maintained during the journey across the Atlantic. The Queen Mary was one of the longest running holders of the prize.
She took the Blue Ribbon in 1937 and held it for 14 years.
The ability of the vessel to move at high speed was not based on technology alone. The skill of the crew in the wheelhouse was pivotal to keeping control of a vessel of this size. We're in the wheelhouse right now, and I imagine this is the nerve center of the ship.
Absolutely. In front of us here, this is the bridge. The two brass wheels here are called the helm. These are the wheels that controlled the 140-ton rudder. She had the largest rudder cast of any ship at that time.
Where would the captain's position be?
The captain would actually be where we are. He would oversee. He would never be on the bridge himself. This would be manned by his officers, unless there was an extreme emergency of some kind.
What kind of qualifications did you need to be a captain of a vessel like this in the 30s?
The reason the Queen Mary had 33 captains over 31 years is because by the time you got to be captain of the Queen Mary, you were almost ready to retire. So it was like the cherry on top of the sundae.
The pinnacle of a long, illustrious career.
Absolutely.
And also in the wheelhouse is the chart room. And
Yes, chart room is there.
all navigation would take place right here.
Correct.
Now, what are these devices right here?
These are all telegraphs that are connected to different parts of the engine room so that the instructions could be given from the men up here at the bridge to the men down in the engine room who were providing the power. These men were steering the course. Those men down at the back end in the engine rooms were providing the power.
Once an order was received from the wheelhouse, the men responsible for acting upon that order were stationed in the ship's massive engineering section. Well, this clearly is the massive engine rooms of the Queen Mary.
This is the aft engine room aboard the ship. It's still intact, where it's open to the public every day from 10 to 6.
Tell me a little bit about the technological capabilities in terms of speed.
She was powered by four 40,000 horsepower steam turbine engines. Inside each one of the engines, there were 257,000 turbine blades. In the 5 boiler rooms along the floor of the ship, they boiled seawater, turned it into steam. The steam was piped back into the engine rooms. When the steam hit those 257,000 blades, they all started turning at once. Each propeller was 35 tons. It was cast of manganese bronze. It took about 14 days for the mold to cool. Once they were hung, They were so perfectly balanced that out of the water you could turn the blades of that propeller with the pressure from your little finger and it would spin. They turned 172 times per minute. That's roughly 3 times per second. This is what powered her to become the fastest liner in the world.
What was the work environment like in the aft engine room?
The engine room here, it was anywhere from 105 to 115 degrees on a daily basis. The men down here were on 4-hour shifts only because of the heat and because of the noise. They actually had to wear specially designed shoes or boots with a half-inch or inch thick sole made of wood, because anything else eventually would have melted. This is the starting platform. All of these instruments and gauges and telegraphs were connected to the bridge. The captain's men in the bridge where we started were steering the course. They had to stay in constant communication with the men down here who were providing the power.
Now, Will, was this post aboard the Queen Mary considered to be one of envy? I mean, is this a job that people want?
I don't know that any of the engineers were envied. Aside from the heat and the noise, it was a very dirty job. I have to say most people that worked aboard the Queen Mary, from what we have learned in the logs and the diaries and the return visits, everyone pretty much loved working aboard the ship. She really was very well thought of, and she was the favored of all the Cunard liners.
She may have been the favored vessel in the Cunard line, but the days of traveling the Atlantic in high luxury were coming to an end. The jet age was approaching, and it would change the Queen Mary forever.
Air travel literally put her out of business. It really started to hit seriously in the 60s. There was a December crossing that only had 444 passengers, so things were getting pretty bad. When she first set sail in 1936, it cost about $26,000 a day to operate the Queen Mary. In 1967, it was over $75,000.
The Queen Mary's operating costs meant that the future was bleak for the vessel, and if an answer couldn't be found soon, the ship might be scrapped for good. Welcome back to our look at the legendary passenger liner, the Queen Mary. During her long history, the ship has experienced a number of unexplained disturbances, so much so that she's been called one of the most haunted places in North America.
The haunted nature of this ship, the paranormal aspects are based in the history of the ship. There are a couple documented deaths on the ship.
People claim to hear things. A lot of banging and clanging, sometimes screaming during the nights in certain areas of the ship. People claim to see images. One of the images that is very popular is an image of a little girl, about 6 or 7 years old, long blonde hair, always something on her head, a bonnet or a hat of some kind. She's seen in porthole windows. She's seen in the boiler room. She's been seen in the hallways, the passageways of the hotel.
The room most associated with the hauntings is room 340.
This was a room that was in service in 1971 when the Queen Mary opened as a hotel. Because of so many reports of strange things going on, like water turning on and off by itself in the bathroom, lights going on. Then at that point, they took the room off the roster and closed it to the public.
Ongoing research on the past events in room 340 had failed to shed any light on the paranormal activity taking place. In fact, the room had no history of disturbances until historians made a startling discovery.
They say there was a short notation in a logbook in 1948 that in room B226, they found a third-class passenger dead in bed. And they never found out what he died from, but what they did find out was cabin B226 was later changed during a conversion to cabin B340.
Another disturbing place aboard the Queen Mary is the isolation ward at the aft portion of the vessel. This area was used to house travelers with highly contagious diseases that might be easily spread amongst the close quarters of a ship at sea. The space was also used as a confinement area for German prisoners of war during World War II. But it is the swimming pool where the highest percentage of sightings occur on the ship. It is no longer in service, and the pool has since been drained. Well, Will, this is the famous and I should say a little infamous swimming pool area.
This is the first class swimming pool, 22 feet wide, 35 feet long.
It's hard to imagine today, but during World War II, the pool was converted to a sleeping space, which held 110 bunks. I understand there are a number of kind of haunting stories associated with the space as well.
Yes, according to psychics and paranormal researchers who have been aboard to study on the ship, they claim that behind that wall at the aft end of the ship there were 18 dressing boxes, and somewhere in that area lies a vortex. A vortex is a spiraling area of energy that allows spirit to travel from one dimension to the other, and they believe that is why there is so much paranormal activity aboard the Queen Mary today.
Despite the story of her hauntings, the ship's rich history, and the story of her stunning transatlantic journeys, the Queen Mary's future was uncertain. Cunard, being unable to operate the ship at a profit, decided that the historic vessel must be sold.
By May of 1967, they decided to put her up for sale, and the largest bid came from the city of Long Beach, California, $3.45 million.
They were looking for ways to bring the city back to life, and part of that was they determined to find a ship of some sort that could be anchored here, kind of become the icon for the city.
The Queen Mary was very nearly scrapped, but the city of Long Beach saved the ship by a very slim margin.
We have been told that Long Beach offered $50,000 more than they would have gotten had they scrapped her.
With the Queen Mary's survival now ensured, thousands of visitors walk her decks every year.
When you think of the amount of human energy and the gamut of emotions that have run through the hull of this ship, she is the ship that has the longest maritime history. I think that creates a very special environment or a very special atmosphere. And people seem to feel that when they come aboard.
To see some of the salons, what was the original first-class dining rooms, and just how grand they are, I think it's important. And then you add to that her incredible role in World War II. The Queen represents a piece of history that none of us will really experience again. I think you have to find ways to save these treasures.
But the Queen Mary's ocean-going legacy doesn't end in Long Beach. In 2004, the Cunard line launched the Queen Mary II, which remains one of their most popular vessels to this day. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.